In this video essay, I'll be looking at two very different documentaries. The Thin Blue Line by Errol Morris, depicting the story of Randall Adams, who was wrongly convicted of a murder, and The Act of Killing by Joshua Oppenheimer, which focuses on individuals who participated in the Indonesia mass killings in 65 to 66. Specifically, I will compare and contrast how these documentaries use different techniques in their interviews to achieve different results. Such techniques are the presence or absence of the director's voice, the framing and positioning of the subjects, whether the interviews are staged or improvised, and the conditions of the interviewee. The first technique I will look at is the presence or absence of the director's voice in the interviews. In The Act of Killing, we can hear Joshua's voice a few times, in comparison to The Thin Blue Line, where Errol Morris's voice cannot be heard once. Both directors have made the conscious decision to either include or not include their own voice. In this clip from The Act of Killing, it is one of the few times we can hear Oppenheimer speaking with the protagonist of the film directly. In this moment, Oppenheimer includes his voice to elicit a personal response from Anwar that he knows will take Anwar off guard.
Jelas, apa yang dirasakan orang yang disiksa Bang Noir jauh lebih buruk dari ini karena Bang Noir tahu ini hanya film. Mereka tahu bahwa mereka akan dibunuh.
Just this simple sentence changes Anwar's perspective on his past, and the camera captures his emotion in what is one of the most pivotal shots of the documentary. In doing so, it completes somewhat of a character arc for Anwar. Instead of taking pride in his actions, he realizes to his horror the severity of his actions and becomes frightened. In contrast, take this scene or any of the interviewees from The Thin Blue Line where the director cannot be heard. The director does not help us to understand everything at once. Instead, he lets the interviewees tell their own story, so the audience has to piece together the puzzle on their own.
No telling the man hours we literally wasted looking for a blue vapor.
Because of this, the documentary builds tension as we become more involved with the narrative and the perspective of the interviewees. Compared to Oppenheimer, he does not want to elicit as much of an emotional response from the subjects. Instead, the narrative of the documentary is the key selling point and is enough to hold the audience's attention. The narrative becomes based largely upon differing factual perspectives rather than emotional perspectives. If we could hear him speaking with the subjects, it might break the spell of the documentary and the audience would have trouble relating emotionally with the many interviewees. Instead, Errol Morris uses scenes of reenactment to provide visual illustrations for the viewer when necessary. The next technique is the framing and positioning of the subjects in the interviews. Take, for example, this side-by-side analysis of a collection of interviews taken from both films. As you can see, in The Act of Killing, the subjects move around often and there are multiple subjects on screen at any one time. In contrast, there is rigid structure to the framing of The Thin Blue Line. The subjects remain in the center of the screen with their eye line hovering on the upper third of the shot, both giving different results. In The Act of Killing, the range of shots used give the documentary a more personal feel. The use of occasional close-ups show emotion and movement provides expression. The subjects can also vibe with each other on screen, which makes for a far more interesting shot to look at. The collective result of these shots is the audience feels connected, as if we become part of the documentary. In The Thin Blue Line, the consistency of the shots disengages with the audience visually and makes us focus more on what the subjects are saying, which is important as the narrative focuses and hinges so much on small details. If the director, Errol Morris, were to use different shots like in The Act of Killing, the audience could easily become distracted and actually lose the thread of the documentary. In fact, if it weren't for the reenactments, the consistency of the shots is so rigid that this documentary could be clearly understood just by listening to it. The next element is the conditions of the interviewees and how this links into the overall feel of the documentary. Instead of looking at every interviewee, I will focus in on specific examples from each documentary, compare them, and look at how they relate to the rest of the interviews. In this first example from The Thin Blue Line, we see David Harris being interviewed. Instantly, there is a visual cue for the audience that this man is in prison, the orange jumpsuit. The symmetrical brick walls behind him also indicate that he is in confinement somewhere, but it's not just David Harris that is in prison. Randall Adams is also in confinement. I feel the rest of the interviews in this film stem from these two. Although the other interviewees are not in prison, their clothes and location also indicate some form of confinement. Most of the important interviewees are wearing suits or formal clothing and are used as a visual cue to indicate their job. The setting of most of the interviews also seem to be their relative workplace. This is clearly intentional from Morris, and it helps to give subtle visual illustrations of the role they have played in the narrative. The consistent framing of the interviewees also plays into this theme of confinement, and through Morris's sculpting of the interviews, we are invited into that world of confinement. In contrast, the conditions of the interviewees in the act of killing are far different. There is an element of irony when you contrast the two. In the thin blue line you have two men, one guilty, one innocent, both in prison for a single murder. But in the act of killing you have many men guilty of killing hundreds, if not thousands of people. Yet these men are not confined or in prison. In fact, they are treated as heroes. Throughout we see Anwar wear clothes that he chooses and that express himself, and he is free to move from place to place. Oppenheimer captures Anwar in this way to highlight the unjustness, that this man has so much freedom when he has taken the lives of so many. It shows a clear contrast between the two styles of Oppenheimer and Morris. Morris captures the interviewees in a confined environment relative to the narrative, whilst Oppenheimer follows his subjects, inviting the viewer into the surreal life of a legitimate killer. In summary, both documentary makers, Errol Morris and Joshua Oppenheimer, use very different interview techniques to achieve different results. Errol Morris uses a more traditional, talking head approach that results in consistency and a very structured layout. In contrast, Oppenheimer uses a varied approach that gives a more lifelike feel to the documentary.